all for being here. You are about to have a phenomenal experience. We have Dr. Tanya Clark and none other than Ytasha Womack. Yes, y'all might not know how big of a deal that is, but y'all finna find out. So, I will invite them to the stage, and as they come to the stage, I'll read a brief bio. Ytasha L. Womack is a critically acclaimed author, filmmaker, dancer, independent scholar, and champion of humanity and imagination. A pioneering voice in the realm of Afrofuturism, she is best known for her groundbreaking book, Afrofuturism. The world of Black sci-fi and fantasy culture, which serves as the leading primer on the intersection of science fiction, futurisms, and Black culture. The book was a finalist for the 2014 Locus Award for Best Nonfiction and continues to shape the global conversation about the role of the imagination in envisioning future worlds. I'm gonna let y'all grown folks read the rest of that bio so you know who you learning from, but I also wanna say for my students in this space, this is one of the people that inspires the work that we do in our classroom. When we talk about the future has been colonized and what is our weight to be able to fight that, this is one of the voices that I learned from. And Dr. Tanya Clark is also one of the voices that I learned from and had the pleasure and honor of studying with her in my own doctoral program here at CAU. So without further ado, Dr. Tanya Clark and Ytasha Womack.
Thanks. I can hear you, but that's because I'm right next to you. You have a lovely voice, by the way, when we can hear you off the microphone.
This one is out, so I'm going to ask y'all to share and I go figure
We'll
this
share.
out.
So I have to say, first off, thank you to Dr. Bess and to Candace and to everyone here at CAU for inviting me to do this. And like Candace said, I have learned about my own use and thinking and musing around Afrofuturism from your book that's projecting here on the screen, Afrofuturism, the World of Black Sci-Fi and Fantasy Culture, which I see as my personal Bible into this way of thinking. And so when Dr. Bess Montgomery asked me to interview you, I was like, that's a no-brainer. So I'm just thrilled to be here to talk with you about your new book, The Afrofuturist Evolution, Creative Paths to Self-Discovery. So let's just dive right in. And one of the things that I wanted everyone to know is that you are we are both alums of Clark Atlanta University. And so this is a full circle moment for me. I'm not gonna tell you when I was here, but sitting here in Davidge on this campus, certainly one that I call home, certainly where I got my roots in terms of understanding what I wanted to do professionally and career-wise. What really struck me about how you opened your book was that you talked about this moment of returning to Clark Atlanta to speak. And that image of standing before a new generation while remembering your younger self really resonated with me. As a fellow alum, I'm also a mother. I'm raising twin boys. I teach over at Morehouse, and I'm hoping that my sons will also have an AUC experience when their time comes. So I'm hoping you can talk about how this return today, as well as your return that you speak of in the book, shaped your understanding of being what you call a nexus of times. So if you could talk about that concept and what being back on Clark Atlanta's campus meant for you and how it continues to kind of speak to your evolution as an Afrofuturist thinker.
Sure, I'll actually read the first page that it addresses that. One, let me say thank you, CAU. You all are amazing. And there's nothing like coming up at Clark Atlanta as a writer. I've sat in this auditorium before, other auditoriums on the campus, and listened to people like California Cooper, you know, early editor of Essence, you know, just, and I remember being inspired and trying to look at these little trinkets of how to become a writer. You know, how do you do this professionally? How do you navigate the industry? What do I connect to? And so to be in this seat very much is, and with you and other alumni, is very much just a way of the circle of influence that our founders and the people who nurtured the AUC experience, it was what they wanted to create. And so just being in that cycle of time is just, it's an honor, actually. It's an honor. So my relationship to thinking of myself as being a nexus of time came together here, and I'm just gonna read this one paragraph and continue on. We stand at the nexus of histories and futures. We are both the product of our personal decisions or occurrences in our lives and the result of a host of geopolitical currents, family decisions, national events, global movements, and cultural beliefs that predate our birth. We are actively creating futures for ourselves, our families, our communities, for people who will be born decades, centuries, perhaps even a millennia later. We stand as a mobile junction of these times. We are creators or co-creators of these new futures, whether we are conscious of it or not. We are in dialogue with times on all sides, whether we are cognizant of it or not, forwarding beliefs and agendas into a tomorrow that was born yesterday or anchoring new wisdom today for the next era. We make decisions birthed from visions of a probable tomorrow, a future sold to us in stories or advertising, a protopia we create as a North Star, and intuition hearkening from a future. So, yes, and I wrote that paragraph, and this entire chapter, actually, the first chapter of this book, well, let me rewind. So, when I wrote the Afrofuturism book several years ago, I wrote it with this desire to talk about the culture of Afrofuturism. I knew students on the campus who were into astrophysics, and they were into, or excuse me, they were into quantum physics, they were into deconstructing hip-hop lyrics, they were thinking about the technologies from African spirituality, they're thinking about how to build new futures, and there's an incident that I talk about in my first book where I referred to, you know, the student I was talking to freshman week, and he was talking about all these things, and I was just like, it was the first time I remembered hearing anyone talk about all of that at once, as if it was one thing. And I said, well, what is this? And I'll never forget what he said. It was something I thought of as a genesis moment for me in Afrofuturism. He said, I don't know. But I grew up thinking, you know, I grew up in a spiritual practice that talked about metaphysics. So I saw it as kind of this philosophy of sorts, but an esoteric one. And I named a couple of books from the metaphysics canon if you study New Thought philosophy. And he had read those books. So I was thinking about it from that concept. He was from Philadelphia, I'm from Chicago, and we're literally just, you know, talking about these ideas. And I would meet a lot of students who were working with these ideas. And of course, he graduated from college, and people go on into these different spaces. And a lot of students didn't know what to do with those concepts. They weren't necessarily artists. They may have been artistically leaning, but it's not something they pursued. So maybe if they had become, graphic designers or something, they'd have been a little more, they'd have thought of it as something they could create. But they were going into other areas. And then later in Chicago, I met a lot of musicians who were, again, talking about these same ideas. And so I was writing as a journalist, and some years down the road, I'm covering entertainment, and eventually I meet someone who tells me she's teaching Afrofuturism, and I say, well, what's that? And it takes me back to this moment here on this campus with that conversation. And I said, wow, he was talking about Afrofuturism. Now, the term Afrofuturism describes a practice that's very old, right? Thinking about your relationship to space and time as a person of African descent or the African diaspora is not a newish idea by far. But the term came of age around the same time that I was here at Clark Atlanta. But we weren't using that term. And, there's a certain circle of people who were, there's a listserv and students on that, and there's a history of how the term kind of found its way. But just, so I lived with the practice that people were very much engaged in, and they didn't have a name for it. And I saw how that caused a sense of disorientation around not feeling comfortable, about wanting to hide your excitement about comic books, or you just want to talk about, theorize about quantum physics, not being a scientist with friends of yours, you see a relationship to your life, but you're not sure if this is something you could talk to broader audiences, even broader Black audiences, because you don't know if you're the outsider. And people don't want to be the outsider within their own culture. Maybe there's some excitement around that if you're an artist. It could be a badge, you can fly around, but if you don't think of yourself that way, and even if you do, and you're comparing yourself to whatever the Black popular culture of the time is, it's not a good feeling for some people. So all of that to say, I kind of wrote about the book thinking about students, much like yourselves, thinking these thoughts and saying, oh, wait, look, there's so many different ways you can connect to this. I met John Jennings, who eventually did this book cover and the other Afrofuturism book cover, and he was telling me, oh yeah, he was naming people like Sun Ra, and I didn't know who Sun Ra was. He was naming Parliament Funkadelic, which of course I knew about them. And so anyway, Octavia Butler, but these are all discussions I had in college. And where we were talking about these ideas, there was a student on this campus who put together a student paper. People were writing in aliases, literally theorizing about Afrofuturism. As a matter of fact, Mark Derry, who wrote the essay Black to the Future, where the term came from, I want to say that they took that essay and put it in the student paper. Now, this was a student finance paper before the internet was really the internet. And the only reason I didn't write for it is because the person putting it out said we had to use an alias. I was a journalism major. And I was like, okay, that's not going to help me for my professional life. So several years after that, the book comes out, it does well. I come to the campus, and I'm like, great, I'm going to tell them the story that I just told you. But I had this very odd experience where the night before, I'm in a hotel room, and I write about this in the book, and I talk about, looking in the mirror, thinking about my speech. This is the grand return. And then it just sort of struck me. It was like, wait, what if that wasn't the beginning? What if this Genesis moment of me talking to the student, a story I would tell a lot, was not actually the beginning? What if the beginning was me on the stage giving that speech and speaking into a past, and that being a resonance that shifted a direction I could have been in, and then that becomes the sort of seedling that I'm connected to. Did I feel the future and didn't know I felt the future? And that's why that moment had such gravitas for me. I mean, I can't even hardly tell you what happened at our homecoming game freshman year, but I can tell you the details of that conversation that I had, standing outside of the Woodruff Library. So That was a story that I told several years ago on this campus. I led with that idea of, wait a minute, there's this multidimensional way that time can function. And because I came through New Thought philosophy, I used a lot of that as my reference point at the time. And then the honors program director, who had been the honors program director when I was at Clark many years ago, she came up to me and she was just yelling, voodoo. And you're like, okay, what am I supposed to do with that? She's like, voodoo. And you're like, okay. And literally she said, she gave a critique. She said, how can you talk about time working in multiple dimensions and you're not referencing voodoo or specific African philosophies to talk about that subject matter? And that's a very HBCU, Clark Atlanta thing for someone to critique you on. And I was standing next to John Jennings, who did this illustration, and I said, well, okay, she's correct. I didn't know, I knew, but there's some things I knew, but not enough to feel comfortable giving a talk about it. And I said, all right, I need to make sure I have more of a working knowledge of talking about voodoo and the symbolism, or talking about the Orishas, or being able to reference other African philosophies around time, something that many of us have a relationship to instinctively because it's in our practices, but maybe not the language for it. Even if you're not calling it the things that they called it of old, even if you're not calling it the things that they call it now, so much of it is steeped in our culture. And another thing that happened during that particular experience here on the campus, I had a conversation with a woman who was not of the culture, and when she was hearing about Afrofuturism, she was like, oh, wow, that's really nice. There are these ideas that W.B. Du Bois had about the future. Oh, too bad none of that stuff really happened. And I'm like, wait a second. Afrofuturism is not the heaven and the great by and by, one day you will get to it. It is very much now. It's a presence and it's a practice. And it's some people, when I tried to say that, it felt like I was proselytizing. I said, wait, okay, I need to write a book for people to realize this isn't, yes, there's the fiction and there's the fantasy, but people, we are informed by what we imagine. We're informed by our visions. We're informed by what we think is going to happen in the future. Our expectations of futures dictate what we do today. We're informed by what we think happened in the past. We're informed by what did happen in the past. So there are many spaces that we're a part of. And going back to just Clark Atlanta, giving that talk, being here, that moment, was one that ultimately led me back to writing this book, and obviously back here to talk about the fact that we are a nexus of time. And so the book itself is broken down into 4 sections with several chapters. One section is on space and time, another is on imagination vision, another is on narrative, nonlinear storytelling, and then another section is on rhythm. And literally it's about looking at different artists and some philosophers or cosmologies on the continent and in the diasporic culture, that's sort of evidence of how people think about space and time.
So that is one of the reasons that's what makes Afrofuturism so powerful, right? Is because it encompasses all of those structures that you've just outlined for us. It can be rhythmic, it can be musical, it can be historical. It's rooted in so many different ancestral rituals and avatars that you talk about in the book as well. And so one of the concepts, and you've talked about having this special relationship between space and time, and then you brought up thinking of the past, the present, and the future, which is very much rooted in the principle of Sankofa, right? So I was hoping you could talk to us about what that means, pulling the past into the present to shape the future, and how it resonates in African cultures and in African American based cultures, and how you write about that and approach that in your work.
Sure. The principle of Sankofa, which many of us are familiar with, comes out of the Akan culture within Ghana. And it's an Adinkra symbol. There are many symbols that are Adinkra symbols. And, you know, in short, Sankofa means to go back and get it. In the context of Afrofuturism, I think about it as a way of taking the best of the past and building for the future. And that sort of relationship to time is one that I think pops up a lot in African diaspora culture. If you think about remixing, you think about collage, you think about quilting, you think about even, you know, a lot of the fashion aesthetic. You know, it's always a bit of mixing, taking these elements of the past and moving it towards the future. And so that's a process. But the symbol of Sankofa, which, let's see, you can see it there at the heart of Major Sankofa. This is an image by John Jennings. There's two versions of that image. Let me see if I have the second one here. Yes. So this image is of a bird looking at an egg on its tail, feet face forward. And this is a symbol, this is the one I kind of grew up seeing the most. You know, it's like, oh, fascinating image, and it makes sense. You know, you're like, okay, looking, you know, you want to, don't forget the past and use those elements to build. And I thought, but something else about that symbol, it also resembles like the infinity symbol. You know, if you think about like a crazy eight, the infinity symbol, you know, it's like an 8 on its side, right? And that sort of symbol is, you know, sort of, it's this ever sort of present symbol. It's speaking to time. And I'd say, wow, this is a process, a way of thinking. And then I thought a lot about, especially when I went to Ghana, the image that I showed you previously. Now that symbol that looks like a heart that's on the shield, that's also a Sankofa symbol. And that's the one, you know, that I said, oh, I didn't really grow up seeing that symbol too much. You know, it's like, why do I see it so much in Ghana? And then I thought, wait, you know, someone said, oh, Ytasha, that symbol's everywhere. And it's in all of the metalwork, right? Right.
Yeah, it's in gates. After I read your book, I went back and I just so happened to be watching a television program. I think it was Law and Order of all things. And the character was a welder, and he was welding that symbol in a fence.
Right, so this points back to the history of, you know, in a lot of African cultures, being a metal worker is a subset of the culture. You know someone's a metal worker just based on their name. It's something I noticed when I was in Ghana, something I noticed when I was in Senegal. And I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. But, you know, it's such a treasured craft. Obviously, when people came here through the transatlantic slave trade, that was the symbol that they were able to put in a lot of spaces. And I just think about the survival of that symbol, the existence of that symbol in plain sight, and the ever-presence and the infinity around that. And so it just made me start to think about so many of our practices are ingrained in the arts and ritual through these different artists, through things that we do, and we're not always, these things give us joy, but we're not always consciously associating it and thinking of it as some space-time, interdimensional thing.
And one of the things you mentioned is this sounds like your concept of liminal spaces. And I was hoping that you could tell us what it means to kind of live in this space on an everyday basis. I was struck by how your book ends with, each chapter ends with reflection questions, and then those reflection questions ask you to build from that thought and move into action. So I am curious to hear what practices help you move through and embrace liminality, right? That space where there might be discomfort between worlds, but also what you point out is that when you are in that space, to embrace the discomfort, because there's also a lot of insight that can come. And this speaks well to our theme of wellness, because I imagine we are all kind of in liminal spaces, whether or not we can articulate what they are, or how we got there, or what parts of our past we're pulling from, and how this is going to impact our future. But I think we are all in some ways living in a liminal space. So what practices do you do to help you kind of embrace that and get the insight?
So a liminal space is this idea of feeling like you're not quite there, but you're not where you were, but you're not where you're trying to be. And sometimes that's, one example I give in the book is, let's say you're laid off for a job, or you're applying for a position, you're not employed, and you're waiting for the job, there's things that you're doing, you don't quite have the job that you want, but you don't have the job that you had. It can feel like an in-between time. There's a book that Iyanla Vanzant wrote called In the Meantime, right? And she also has one called In the Void, and it's this idea of being it's like, what do you do in that space? And I remember reading this shortly after college, Iyanla Vanzant's book, because I kind of felt like, I'm not where I want to be, and I'm not in school, and you're trying to figure out a way. And she had expressed that this is an opportunity to go deep, to think about there's opportunities and there's lessons in this space. And you're like, well, like what, right? Outside of trying to get there. And it's not that you stop trying to get there and you give up on what you're trying to do, but you find some sort of relationship to what are your emotions? What do you really want? What makes you happy? What doesn't make you happy? How can you bring more joy into the moment? What makes you feel as if you are progressing? What doesn't make you feel that way? And those kinds of insights, next thing you know, you are in another space. But another way I talk about liminal space, I talk about the fact that we're always multitasking. So, you could be, I give an example of the book, sitting, I'm in an airport, but I'm on the phone, and, some of my family are going to a wedding. I'm not going to the wedding, but I have a visual about the wedding, what the wedding is going to look like. I'm talking to a friend. The friend is on the East Coast. I'm in Chicago. I'm about to get on a plane, but I'm not on the plane. So there's this, I'm texting. I'm looking at a text. So I'm in, and then also I'm thinking about where I'm going to go. The hotel, how I'm going to check in. The place I'm going to, New York, I know the hotel I'm staying in, I know that process. So in each of these spaces, I'm having feelings. I'm having emotions about these things. Now, I can think about all of this in the span of 5 seconds, all right? This is, I named, a half a dozen places that you could be in 5 seconds. Physically, I'm here. My mind, on the other hand, is in a lot of different places. So if I'm thinking about the wedding I'm not going to and all the fun they're going to have, and man, I need to make sure that I hang out with the family more often, or, oh, this place I'm going, oh, it's going to be great. Oh, I have to make sure that I do this and that. So, some feelings I could have anguish, and others, at the same time, I could be having a state of joy. Another moment, I could feel a level of regret. Then I'm like impassioned about some conversation I might be having on the phone. All of that is impacting me in the present. Not to mention what kind of trajectories it's setting up in the probable futures that could happen. But I'm making decisions about next steps, although I'm in one space and I'm in all these different spaces. So that, no one would call that time travel, but it is being interdimensional. It's an example of you being at the nexus of space and time. And so those levels of thoughts, it kind of shows how multifaceted you are. Because we do all of that all the time. And by the end of the day, you can be exhausted and you're wondering why. Well, you just traveled to 9,000 places. You're thinking about the work you have to do and you're like, oh my gosh. And then you think about, some of the reflection questions are about how do you feel when you think about these things? Are there places you imagine being that give you joy? Are there places you kind of fantasize about that don't give you joy? Maybe it gives you a sense of release. And what's your relationship to the things you fantasize about that give you joy versus, are there things you're thinking about that make you sad that haven't happened or did happen? Why is that a recurring feeling for you? And so these are things that helps you sort of parse out. There's exercises about being in the presence or meditating, and these things are about stilling your mind and so forth. But there's just, I think it's a question of awareness and to some extent choice.
And Afrofuturism comes into play, how I see it in your explanation is because it allows us to know that we are not wrong, right? We're not wrong for experiencing all of these things at once. Because as Sankofa would tell us, that's part of what we do culturally, right? That's part of what we do ancestrally, and that we can parse it out and make sense of it for our lives in the present moment and in the future. That's one of the reasons why I think Afrofuturism is so powerful. I want to move to the point in your book where you talk about our motto of our beloved institution. What is it? That one too. But I'm talking about find a way or make one, because you have this wonderful metaphor in the book about building a boat. Like, we often have to build a boat, write the blueprint, and learn to swim all at the same time. And when you said that, I immediately thought of Clark Atlanta's motto and how I often recite it in my mind when I'm going through my own tribulations. And then in chapter 8, you talked about Catherine Dunham, who did just that, right? She found a way to get her voice through dance, and by living with the Haitian culture and learning Vodun and doing so unapologetically and navigating different cultures and different time periods and different languages. And she found a way to do the work that pleased her and got her voice out there, which you remind us was the impetus behind Alvin Ailey, who was able to see Catherine Dunham and then start the Alvin Ailey Dance Institute. So I couldn't help but see this as an Afrofuturist moment. And you couch that within this conversation about optimism. And so it's very hard for us to be optimistic right now, yes? So how do you see our motto resonating with the kind of action-based, ancestral, and creative optimism that you describe in your book?
Well, in the book, I talk about Catherine Dunham, and I'm a dancer. I grew up dancing, taking all kinds of classes, dancing here at CAU. Dance gives me joy, dance gives me life. It's very much an interdimensional relationship to space and time as well. And I had a lot of fun writing about that in the rhythm section. But when I was looking to have to provide examples about optimism, I thought about the fact that Catherine Dunham was, we laud her for all the research that she did, but she was doing this like at the onset of the Great Depression. So she's a Black woman from the Chicagoland area. She was dancing ballet. She then, had like a dance company. And then she, decided to be an anthropologist and got a grant to be able to study like African diasporic dances in the Caribbean. So she's going to Haiti, she's going to Trinidad. And I just, the fact that that's happening during the Great Depression, like, let's just start there. This is the Great Depression for everybody. And here she is, getting money and being able to fund travel. She's a Black woman traveling by herself to another country in the early 1930s. Like, this is not typical stuff here. Some of our parents would have issues with us wanting to go to the Caribbean by ourselves today. Forget like 31, 32. And I think about the fact she's going there and she's studying these dances, and now all of us, we're like, oh, African dance, the African diasporic dance, this is great stuff. It was not considered great stuff in that period of time. And the dances that she wanted to learn were these spiritual dances where she had to go into rural areas and literally, it's not like she learned social dances. Obviously, you could go to clubs and parties and learn those, but she's staying with high society people in these countries, and then she has to go off into these rural areas, sometimes not even telling the people she's staying with that that's why she's really there. Then she has to, she can't just observe it. She has to go through the process of becoming an initiate in some of these practices. Zora Neale Hurston, same thing. Some of these stories, she had to become an initiate in hoodoo to learn this stuff. You don't just watch from afar. They won't even let you in. And she's going with the desire. She had such a strong desire to learn a root and a basis for these different dances that she's just open to stepping out of all kinds of boxes and expectations to do so. Then she comes back and, she kind of pauses her pursuit. She could have become a traditional anthropologist, right? Just wrote some papers about it, which would have been grand and we'd have all been happy. We would have quoted her. But in addition to that, she also started a dance company and then had to teach people these dances, among others. Now, you didn't have Black dance companies in that way at that time. A lot of Black dancers were, when it came to performance, it could be something, maybe you had tap dancers, you had shake dancers, but you couldn't be in ballet. Modern dance was becoming a thing as she was doing this. So she's literally taking people who can sort of dance or do gymnastics or whatever, teaching them things they've never done before, coming up with a whole aesthetic, and then not just putting on a show locally and being done, deciding to tour and finance tours and making costumes and going to Europe and going throughout the Caribbean and being one of the founders of the African dance aesthetic that helped Black people in all spaces. So she was very instrumental when Senegal was becoming an independent nation and laying the foundation for their creative arts and their valuing of the arts and the African aesthetic. And that ties into negritude. And so my whole point is, when it comes to optimism, this is someone who had a vision and a mission, and regardless of what anybody was thinking or doing, was finding ways, creating joy. And she started in the Great Depression, but this work continued on. So by the time, that she's writing and reflecting on her life, this is like 1960 something. She'd been doing this stuff for 30 years, and the Black arts movement wasn't even the Black arts movement yet. So people, you think about what do you have? I remember a minister, Reverend Johnny Coleman, she was just like, start with what you have now. And, find a way or make one. That comes from a real space. When we're here in school, you're like, find a way to make one. Okay, sounds grand. But when you get out there, you're like, this is what they were talking about. The role that motto plays takes on a whole new way of thinking.
So I know that we are on our Monday, Wednesday, Friday schedule, and I do want to open it up for students to ask questions. So are there any questions of Ytasha?
It is a pleasure to meet you. We are a little bit more than 6 degrees separated. I grew up in Evanston. My family is from Robbins. I'm actually getting my PhD. Well, I got my PhD here at CAU. So I am done and graduating this year. But I teach across the street at Spelman, and I teach Afrofuturist narratives, and I use your text as the anchor for our course. So we are using your text, and we're also reading Midnight Robber, Kindred, Freshwater, and the 5th season. So they just asked me yesterday about trauma. And so they were like, trauma exists in all of these Black speculative texts. And so they're like, why does the trauma exist? So we talked a little bit about oppositional gaze from bell hooks, and we talked a little bit about the use of imagination for liberation, as you talk about in your text. But I just wanted to ask you your thoughts on how trauma serves in Afrofuturist narratives, so I can go back and sound absolutely cool that I asked you this. You can tell me.
Oh, wow. Hey there. Wow. Okay. One of the beauties of the term Afrofuturism is that it provides this opportunity to create in spite of. So some of the texts that you're mentioning came about before the term's existence, and this decided, thoughtful focus on moving forward in spite of creating worlds without having to use a certain kind of reference point, if you choose. So I think what happens with some storytellers, and you see this in traditional science fiction as well, there's this idea of you want to work out a present issue, and you're doing it in a future tale or in a fantastic way. So, as you well know, you can look at stories and they're talking about little green aliens coming from space. Well, these become metaphors for how race functions in society and the fear of the great takeover, the invasion, et cetera, right? And I think for other people, there's other things they might have speculated about and or experienced that have deep impact. You think about some of Octavia Butler's work, and it's, okay, how does this play out in another world in a fantastic way? How can I talk about this? How can I resolve this issue for myself? It might seem more palatable to do so in another story world, in a future space, with another character who's not you, who has some tropes that you would like to have, who can deal with some of these things, and you're working through these issues. And then for some people, they're working out another set of issues that might not ring to us as a specific kind of trauma. I do think that regardless of the various things that have happened in our culture, that sometimes there's a way of framing our art or there being more of a receptivity to us talking about Black life through the lens of trauma, as if that's the only way to talk about yourself. And there's a receptivity to that. And when you're talking about being from an empowered space, which doesn't mean you didn't have, traumatic things that happened or weren't shaped by it, it becomes a little harder for some people to see what are you talking about. So one of the opportunities that Afrofuturism, the existence of the term, provides is a way to think about how things exist outside of that space. So someone like, and you see this a lot, interestingly, more so almost in music. I think about artists like a Sun Ra, or, we have Alice Coltrane's image that's up. These are people who were working with the idea of the altered destiny or altered spaces, and those altered spaces as healing spaces to be the myth or to be the person who you ought to be but can't be in this one, and creating a space for that. You think about, and you see it to some extent in certain kinds of films and TV shows, and I think you see it more or less in different fantasy and other narratives that are coming out. So the question that your student asked was a question I often wondered, not necessarily reading speculative fiction, but reading other projects and thinking, okay, whoa, wow, right? And is there room for other kinds of storytelling in addition to that? And that's always the charge, to write about Black life and all its many facets and fancies and opportunities. And Afrofuturism, the existence of independent publishing, provides an opportunity to do that in another way that didn't always exist in the times of some of our other writings, some of our classics, which isn't to say people weren't thinking those things. They were writing some of that stuff, but maybe it wasn't published. And we're constantly seeing newer works coming out. Claude McKay's, Amiable with Big Teeth, completely redefined how we even think about the Harlem Renaissance. Or even how we think about 1930s, going back to that awful time, right? And you're sitting there thinking, he's writing about Ethiopians, being challenged by Italy, coming to Harlem, raising money. He's critiquing Marxism and how it's sort of engaging with the community. And so these are and you can say, well, that's not a speculative fiction story. But people who read that and decided not to put it out saw real life as a speculative fiction story that they didn't think had a kind of reality that could connect. So what's sort of ironic is some of our day-to-day life can sound like speculative fiction to people who think our lives are supposed to be something else. So, and so that sort of surrealness is one that we're always sort of dealing with in Black speculative fiction, because there's a reality to being in the present and this liminality, or engaging with ancestors. Or you think about films like Daughter of the Dust, and it's being told by an unborn child, talking about her lineage in a space that she was never in physically. And that's sort of discussed like, a colleague of mine, Floyd Webb, who worked on that film, said that it was supposed to be part of a trilogy that was Afrofuturist. But at its foundation, when Julie Dash did that film, it's a present tale. And you can say, oh, this is sort of speculative, but that's also how people see the world. Now, some of us might not describe our day-to-day activities in that way, but that doesn't mean that's not what's happening. We're not describing that in that way because we're sort of told that that's not the way you're supposed to describe your experiences, that that's not as acceptable. I think people like Toni Morrison pushed that. I think a lot of the things she wrote about could technically be described as speculative in nature because it was very liminal. I think, was it Beloved? I read here at Clark Atlanta as in my African American history class. in part because our instructor said we're sitting here saying, you know, comparing something to slavery, and she's like, no, that's not slavery. This is what bondage was, and this is how people escaped it in their mind. So these imaginations or these, you know, traumas or these visions or the born, the not born, the future, the past, these sort of layered experiences are, they're always communicating. To what extent we put that in story, to what extent people, you know, speak of the trauma or moving through it or the adventures, I think we're in a space where we can tell a lot of different stories now, and there's a lot of receptivity to it.
And to piggyback off of that, it's also, trauma is just one arc of the story, right? It's just one line of the story. But Afrofuturism allows us to think about it as a cosmology, which is the way you describe it in your book, so that there is no linear way in which to interpret one group of people's experiences, but that the way you describe it is more of a spiral rather than a straight line.
Also, and it's an unresolved emotion. And sometimes in the book, I use that term at some point because I don't know how we're using the word trauma sometimes. And for me, unresolved emotion separates it from an act, from a moment in time to a kind of application beyond that moment. It's the unresolved emotion that's sort of carrying on and repeating itself, as opposed to an incident. And something about that for me, and talking about it in that way, creates more of an agency to parse things out and to let something flow away. Say, oh, this is an unresolved emotion. This isn't now. Okay, I can make a choice or work to make a choice to shift, because we can shift spaces. You know, there is a choice about, you know, even if there's limitation around physical spaces, there's choices mentally about where you're envisioning yourself and where you're going. And that sort of awareness of choice has saved lives, not to mention created great stories.
And to piggyback on the presentation earlier, and the more we do that, right, we will rewire our brain such that we are now enduring rather than surviving. I think that was part of my takeaway from your presentation. Are there any other questions from the audience? Because I got more, I can keep going. Okay.
Hello. My question for you is, I hear you talking about like a cosmology or an episteme, and you mentioned John Jennings, and so once upon a time he gave us a word, sankofaration, and then just kind of was like, do with that what you will. So my question to you, as you're talking about Afrofuturism, and we're talking about time not necessarily being linear, and all the ways in which we can navigate different times and liminal spaces, are you arguing that Afrofuturism in itself is like a cosmology for us to rest in and to lean into? Or is it something else? Because I just want to make sure I got that part clear first before I ask the second part.
Well, what's the second part? Okay.
The second part is in relation, because I teach Afrofuturism with Afropessimism, because I think it's important for people to also understand how Blackness functions in that way, or how it has been constructed to function. And so I really want to understand if Afrofuturism is an episteme or a cosmology, how can I better articulate that in relationship to how I'm teaching Afropessimism?
I think you can look at Afrofuturism is an expression of a relationship to space and time, because all cultures have relationships to space and time. And it's evidence in the art, the music, the fashion, the architecture, the linguistics, the rhythm of the speech, etc. So I think There is how it can function as aesthetic in art, etc. I also think it can be processed. But this process can reference a lot of different African diasporic, and other cosmologies. So I'm not saying it's a cosmology per se, but I'm saying it can function as a practice where you're engaging cosmologies, which someone could say, oh, it also functions as cosmology, which to me, I don't have an issue with that. Because I think there's aesthetic, there's it as cosmology, it can function a lot of different ways, wherever people are choosing to operate from. And for me, it becomes an opportunity to reference these different things, whether I'm talking about Ifa, or I'm talking about hoodoo, or I'm thinking about the Congolese cosmogram, or I'm looking at Sankofa, or I want to look at Asar or Set, or any of these practices, and look at what people have said about these things to help them thrive and move forward. If that informs me in a way that it doesn't necessarily inform you, or you take one piece and I take another piece and you take another piece, it becomes a way to actively engage with these ideas and think about them, instead of saying, I must become a this, or I must become a that. You can look at it and say, okay, this is the philosophy around this idea. This is the philosophy around that idea. I see a relationship. I see a difference. I can take a bit of this and build to move forward in a conscious way. Or I can say, you know what, this part here doesn't apply for me in this way, but it does apply for me in that way. And it's to give us a lens to engage these things and call it something. That's how I see it. So as it relates to Afro-pessimism, I don't, there's you can see so much that can tell you don't need to look forward and expect or want anything. I don't think you have to proselytize about that. I could step out anybody and somebody could tell me why I can't do something, why it would never happen, why I shouldn't try, why I shouldn't think about it. You need to go home, blah, blah, blah. They will never. Who needs a speech on that? Is that something you get you got to get degrees in to articulate? I would like to say I get it, but I don't. I just don't. I don't see how that's helping anybody, but it could help some people because it frees them in some sort of way. And if that frees them, okay. So that's one of those things, if it works for somebody, I can't talk about it. I can't really even, I try to wrap my mind, no, I don't try really. I've read enough to be, okay, all right. So if this frees and it helps people build and it helps them live happy lives, that's fine. I haven't engaged with people where that helps them live a happy life. I haven't experienced that personally, which doesn't mean it's never happened. So if you found a way to engage both these things, and people are like, this is empowering me to move forward, I don't know how you could, I wrestle with being a person who's gotten some kind of education that someone helped you pay for, and that was a dream at some point in time, and then me going out telling somebody what they can't do. I just wrestle with that conceptually. But just because I wrestle with it conceptually doesn't mean it's not something that people do. And that there's not a relationship to it, and why they do it, and you know, and so I can't talk about that very far and give you anything other than to say, dreams move you forward. You talked about optimism earlier. The optimism is, you know, I mentioned Congressman John Lewis, and, you know, him juxtaposing him with Martin Luther King. And he will tell you in a second, like most people, Martin Luther King is very much a visionary. He will say there are some things Martin Luther King said were going to happen. He didn't know if they were going to happen, but at some point he made a decision that they must, and that there's some things that had to stop, and that he was going to dedicate himself to creating a world that valued humanity, and that dedication was what moved him forward and moved us forward. So that becomes a kind of optimism in practice, because it's not, I see it. Maybe at some point he didn't see the mountaintop at all. He was like, you know, and that happens in these dynamics. You have somebody else, they see it. You're like, well, if they see it and they're giving me enough confidence to do a little more than I did before, then I can support them and work with them. And then through the work and through the work and through the work, you might not see it, but you believe it. Or you say, hey, it's got to happen, and this is what I've dedicated myself to, and that opens doors and creates opportunities and creates change. So that's just sort of how, I don't know, I hope I answered the question.
Because my students and I really have a hard time with Afro-pessimism, because to your point, it's like, well, why are you telling us this? If there's no hope, if this is all Blackness can be, or how Blackness functions, which is how we come back to the Afrofuturism. And how do you envision other futures? How do you lean into the making, the tinkering, the imagination that can direct your path in that way?
Well, the challenge is that racism isn't logical. So when you're trying to think yourself out of the racism box, which created a certain kind of this sort of Blackness, whiteness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, none of that's logical. Even from a power dynamic standpoint, it's not logical. So we try to apply logic. And because you're trying to apply logic to the non-logical, you just get on a loop. And that lends to, you know, that creates that kind of thinking. And, you know, so that's where the wrestling begins. You have some of the greatest minds coming up with a lot of stuff, but you get on that treadmill, man, it's hard to get off it, you know, and so, you know, maybe that's part of the chore. How do you get off the treadmill? You know, how do you get off, how do you stay off, how do you not wind up being looped back into this thing, which, you know, is being upheld as something that exists, that can have its own gravitas to it, freeing oneself of that. And you have artists like a Sun Ra who sit and talk about the altar destiny. That was his way of freeing himself. He's like, I am of the cosmos, not from this world. That's how I engage. I'm here to heal the world. You know, I taught a class recently. One of his, someone in his band, Ahmed Abdullah, said that he thought of Sun Ra as an enlightened being. So maybe you claim the path of the great mystic, and that works for you. You know, maybe it's thinking about the Congolese cosmogram as it relates to operating in a cipher, and that synergy. You know, where you learn that the cosmogram is a flattened spiral, and it's connecting the astral and connecting the earth plane. Maybe that sense of weight, I'm a cosmic entity, you know, I'm this enlightened entity. Maybe it's thinking of yourself at the intersection, the crossroads. You are connecting to the energy of Alegba. Whatever helps to shift a paradigm that is saying you are something else, you know, and there are many a thing to pull from that many artists have engaged in their works. Don Cherry, you think about all these avant-garde jazz artists, them building these futures and these worlds. Techno music was created literally. They thought of the music in Detroit as a virus to destroy the isms of the world. That's what it was created to do. Maybe it did. Maybe we're on some other kind of timeline. Maybe we need to hop timelines. I don't know, but I think that it's all because so many people gave their lives to thinking about these things, that it's something to pull from.
Chapter 8. That's all I'm gonna say. It's chapter 8. It's on. It's called "The Fortitude and Optimism: The Courage to Expect More." I think your class will have a rich discussion around these topics as it relates to the conversations you're having with Afro-pessimism. Thank you. I think we have maybe time for one more. Anyone else from the audience? Well, I will wrap up with a question that is about land and our environment, because it's often one that isn't foregrounded in conversations about African diasporic cultural practices, or even in Afrofuturist work. But you dedicate a whole chapter about nature. And I was struck by that chapter because I am teaching a class on speculative fiction as well, and it's themed around the elements. So we've been talking a lot about nature and how we impact it and vice versa. So how do you see nature and ecology shaping the stories that we tell? What is the role of land and how land holds memory, and what does the earth, what does the land and nature tell us? Because I think that, again, thinking about kind of where we in this space that we're in politically, we have a government that is trying to sever our connections to the earth and to land. And so I'm thinking that there are grave implications for us as a culture and even as a humanity as that gap continues to increase. So how do you see nature and ecology and its connection to Afrofuturism?
Sure, well that chapter is I added that chapter in the 11th hour, in part because I was asked to speak at an Afrofuturism and climate change symposium that was in Chicago. And the woman who coordinated it, Aaliyah, she was saying, Aaliyah Collins, she was asking me to kind of present and talk about Afrofuturism. And I said, well, how do you want me to approach it? Do you want me to talk about, food sources? Do you want me to talk about, access to resources? And she was like, well, they're all interrelated, so pick one. We're going to talk about all of them. I said, oh, wow, okay. And I said, in a very grounded way, as a person who grew up in Chicago, my relationship to, there's a whole urban farming collectives that are popping up all over the place. And when you're a descendant of the Great Migration, there is, at least for me, there was a part of like this family narrative of people not wanting to go back to this farming, working the land. Even, certain colleagues of mine, they might be super into camping. Camping to me is like a half step away from this idea of working the land. Right, and so you can argue, is that an unresolved emotion coming from another space? But then of course these people have very healthy relationships with land and environment. And I said, okay, well that's a space to be healed. And as a storyteller, you know, from the very basic level, I said, okay, well, just as a Chicagoan who had family that was from Mississippi and Texas, I said, do I know, you know, there's a lot of talk about indigeneity. Do I know the story of the indigenous people of this space in Chicago? Not where the family used to be, not these other narratives, just where I was. Do I know the story of the lake? And I went to, you know, the places like Dakar and Ghana, and there's water spirits, and I said, there have to be stories of spirits in this particular lake, but it was in the Potawatomi culture where there's a story about that. And that's not a city-known story. But there was one about the hawk. You always hear about Chicago and how windy it is, and the hawk, they're like, oh, the hawk's gonna get you. I didn't realize that was a Potawatomi story, you know, of the spirit of the wind being that of a hawk. And maybe in part because I didn't see many hawks in Chicago, because terrains have changed. And then it became, well, what grows here? So, and a lot of people growing up there, they're like, dandelions, you know, and it's like, well, dandelions aren't native to America. Didn't know that one. And you're like, mulberries, like, you get in these lakes, it's like, what fish are in the lake? These basic things were questions that, you know, many of us didn't necessarily know. And we didn't know it because it didn't come up. So the challenge became, can you say what grows naturally in the place where you live, wherever you move to, not where you're from, and this, that, wherever you live, what stories are part of the indigenous people who were there, in addition to just the general histories, but what are the stories of the land? And then, what was the third one? Oh, and what are some things that could grow here that were not always, that aren't necessarily from here? And just that little simple question, at one point in time, many people could have answered that. They could have said what grew naturally in Atlanta and what this and that, blah, blah, blah. But now that's considered specialized knowledge. You have to almost get a doctorate somewhere, or you grew up with families who had lived in this land for, you know, centuries, possibly. So, and it started making me think about access to land. You know, you couldn't always be free to be in all spaces. These so-called nature spaces, if you're in cities and you go out to nature, these were not welcoming places to be, to sit and just enjoy and learn about the land and what grew here and there. And so, so there's, you know, some unresolved emotions around these things, especially when we start talking about indigeneity, then as migratory peoples, forced migrations. It makes it seem like you don't belong anywhere. But there's also nomadic relationships to land. And that's as ancient as the idea of being indigenous to a space. And so I just think it's an opportunity, because many of us are moving around and living in a lot of places, to think about, to just consciously just sort of work this muscle of what grows here, what are the stories here, and building a relationship with that. I think that becomes empowering.
Well, I think we are just about out of time. We're probably over time, but I have enjoyed this so much. Thank you. This has been a real treat. Thank you very much.
I would just like to say it's a pleasure being in conversation with a fellow alumni, especially one who's familiar with the work. Thank you for reading the book. Thank you for being here. Thank you for these wonderful questions. This is the first dialogue I've had that's an in-depth one about the book. The book just came out 2 weeks ago. So it's very special to be here sharing with all of you, and thank you so much.
We have some donated books because we want you to be able to experience Ytasha Womack's work. And so, I would like 3 volunteers to answer this question. What is one thing that you learned from today's conversation with Dr. Clark and Ytasha Womack? 3 hands. These free books, y'all. Look, Tony, Mary. Okay. All right, Mary Elizabeth, what have you learned from the conversation today? Look, you got notes. Come on.
So I wrote a play, and it has been described as an Afrofuturistic play because when you read it, you think you're in one time, but you're in another time. And so for myself, in moving through my life and getting through a lot of trauma, I've always been a daydreamer. And so I really appreciate when you were talking about Afrofuturism as an expression of space and time, and this ability to be one place physically, but be so many other places in your mind, especially because we do have so much technology. So when I'm talking to people about like, how are we present in our interpersonal communication, I'm always like taking the time to put our devices down. But again, one thing I'm walking away from today is, again, Afrofuturism as this expression of space and time. So I really appreciated this conversation.
Thank you, Mary Elizabeth. I should also mention that these books were donated from the bookstore 44th and 3rd, which is right up the street. We are thankful for their support. Okay, and Tony, what you learned? Come on. Okay, well, I need 2 more students, y'all. You can do it. It's a safe space. Tell us what you learned. Come on. Brave one, thank you. You better walk down, you better walk. You better walk down, you better walk. Tell.
Thank you. As my professor said, we have your book was our foundational course for our class, and so just hearing you speak about your own definition of Afrofuturism and specifically our question about trauma, it really opened up a lot of more questions for us that I'm pretty sure we're going to discuss in class. But specifically how you talk about the difference between trauma and the actual action of trauma, what causes trauma, and how trauma carries into how you can kind of take authority over that trauma and change it, is something that I and I think that was really cool because I think when we hear trauma, it kind of has a negative connotation to it, but it can also be empowering in these different spaces. So
Come on. Come on, bring it on down. Thank you. Okay, student, let's go. You better represent.
Oh, first I want to say, hey, I'm a freshman at Morehouse, one of the students. But yeah, high school I went to a PWI, so a lot of white people, and growing up in that space, especially being a senior, people be like, what college are you going to? And most people didn't know about Morehouse or didn't know what Morehouse was. And so one of the things that you talked about that caught my attention, and that I learned the term for it that I didn't really know before, was about the speculative fiction and how people can see the way you're living and kind of is a sort of fiction to them, but it's kind of your reality just because they don't know about it, bro.
Thank you all so much for being here. Again, Dr. Tanya Clark and Ytasha Womack. Thank you for such a mind-blowing conversation. If we could give them one final round of applause. So this was day 2. Tomorrow is day 3. There is an Eventbrite to register. If you have not registered, we want to see your names. We want to be able to reach out to you and say thank you for being here. We start tomorrow at 9:25 with Dr. Georgie Bess Montgomery. Davidge Auditorium right here. Dr. Bess will be in conversation with Dr. Kakova Zalditu Selassie, AKA Mama Coco. And we gonna have a time. So thank you.
We will be discussing, having a conversation, you all talked about trauma. Certainly, when you're reading, say, Black fiction, there's lots of trauma there because we're writing about our lives. But what is also in those texts are the various methods of self-care, ways to heal, which are not always the traditional ways of healing, how spirituality is used to heal, which is different from, say, Christianity, and people mix it. So they give us the problem, but we are also given to a solution of how to heal. You know, we talked earlier about Mama Gloria Naylor's Women of Brewster Police, and Maddie takes Seal and rocks her back to help will her back to life. So you have this throughout those texts. So that will be our conversation on tomorrow, followed by Juju Bay and Jada Renee.
Talk about, oh, okay, so that workshop will be, I will be in conversation with Juju, who wrote
The Book of Juju, which is a really great primer for learning some ancestral, cultural, and spiritual technologies. Jada Renee is a brilliant poet coming out of Chicago, actually. And she wrote a poem called Drill. Thank you, Professor Grohl, for introducing me to her work. But Drill changed my life and helped me think about poetry as a site of memory and a space of exorcism. And so I'm really excited about that conversation, and then we will have some workshops about writing yourself into existence. That's one that I'll be hosting as well. So please share out with your friends, come through, pull up, all of that, okay?
And if you all remember Arthur Flowers, who was our guest last year, Juju Bay is, he is a mentor to Juju Bay. So we have Arthur Flowers again.
I just wanted to give an homage to Professor Joan Morgan and to Dr. Jenkins. They both played a really major role in all the work I'm doing here today. So just thanks to them.
And Glenn Ryan always talks about you. All you got to bring her here, so I'm so pleased that I could say to Glenn Ryan, she's here.
I know. She's the one, she's been trying to get me to go to this, like, the conference, and she was working on it, and I was reaching out to her, and I wasn't hearing from her, and then, found out. Anyway, nonetheless, thank you, Dr. Morgan.
Thank you.